for me, it's easier to push harder than it is to say, I did something stupid here and I need to change. I can say that, but what's my natural default is like, you know what, how can I just push harder? And I think a lot of us also, they come from, let's call it a more physical background, like gym, jiu-jitsu, whatever it may be. We become really, really good at pushing harder because that actually gives a lot of results there. And sometimes we default to that when it's not the right thing to do. Welcome to today's episode, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about why we rebranded the podcast, why sometimes our blind spots get in the way, and why sometimes it's not actually our blind spots, but it's our desires and wants that cause us to purposely not look at the truth, even though we can see it. So this episode today is going to be very helpful for you if there's something that you really want to see succeed, or an employee you really want to work out, or some kind of project, whatever it may be, that you really, really want to make happen. There's an emotional connection there, but it's not going the way you'd like to actually see it go. So what we're going to be talking about today is a lot about how we can understand when we're ignoring reality, how to make sure you don't ignore that, and what to do about it, as well as a couple of common mistakes. And in that whole case, we're going to be talking about why we rebranded the pod and how I came to that realization. So with that said, Alex, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Itamar. Excited to be here. I think I've made this mistake many times myself, so excited to get into it.
Cool. Any initial thoughts before we get kicking?
I'm just really interested in the general topic. I think it's something which plagues entrepreneurs a lot. Very rarely do things work out faster, simpler, easier, better than we anticipated. And then trying to actually diagnose what was going wrong and how to improve it is often the sort of murky territory where we sort of spin our wheels. So I'm really interested to sort of dive into this topic.
Cool. So we're going to use the podcast as a case study to kind of explain this principle. Now, the podcast title was not working. Like, we even got a review when somebody said, don't let the podcast title fool you, the weird title fool you. It's actually really good practical stuff. And it also took that review, and I think you actually told me something about it, and a couple of the lead guys told me as well, like, dude, like, you have really good content in your podcast, but it kind of feels awkward to share with people because it's a weird title. And the reality was that when I looked at it, I was like, why am I not listening to reality? Reality is telling me something. I'm not listening to it. The podcast is really good. People are telling me they like it, but it's not growing the way we would like it. Something here is wrong. And it wasn't a blind spot. Again, because I could see that. People were telling me that. I was aware of that. However, the reality was that I was emotionally connected to something. And the moment we emotionally want something, we become illogical. Like, that's literally the term. Like, when you say someone's being emotional here, you're not meaning, oh, this person's being very rational and thoughtful. So they're being illogical. And I got caught up on something. I remember like reading from Tim Ferriss, he's saying the power of owning a term. Like, from him, it was lifestyle design. He owned that. And that was always something that was associated with him. And I remember back in the day thinking, I want to own a term. What if I can own a term like emotional fortitude? But nobody else wanted that. The people who come into the program, the people who want to listen to the podcast, they're not interested in that. They don't even know what that means. It just creates confusion. And I was not willing to accept reality because I was blinded by my emotional wants. And I think...
Sorry to cut in, but did you just say that you have emotions?
I do, even wants and all that kind of jazz. Desires, I have fears, insecurities, all that kind of good stuff.
Itamar actually has emotions. All right.
Sorry. Joking aside, it's funny because like people often are surprised when I talk about that. I think the reason I'm able to be an expert in this field is because I also experienced it and I learned how to deal with it. I think truthfully, I'm a less emotional person than most people. And that's why I'm able to also kind of like go out of it and see it from a different angle because I'm not so caught up in it. But if I was completely void of it, let's say, I wouldn't be able to actually understand how it's going on. I wouldn't be able to have that experience and translate how to get past it or whatever it may be. I think I'm like at the emotional spectrum. I'm just enough where I have enough emotions to understand what it is. Right. And I also don't have too much where I get overwhelmed by it. And I think that's what allows me to play really well in this field, so to speak.
Agreed. Yeah, I think that's just super.
Yeah, but I appreciate you giving me a little bit of shit about it. Move on. Ready to move on?
Ready to move on.
Cool. All right. So here's the thing. Again, like the moment we want something and we start to think in terms of I hope, or I want, or I'd like, or that would be great, instead of it would make sense that this is how things will work out, things start to change. We basically lose half our IQ. All of a sudden we become emotionally attached and we're not actually thinking, wait, what is reality telling me this is likely to work or not likely to work? We lose our ability to judge things based on what they are because we just see them for how we would like for them to be. And that's what happened with the podcast. Like, I didn't think about it from the first principle of, okay, we're using it as a tool to help people and also draw more clients. For both these people that want to be helped and for those potential clients, what would be the simplest way for them to enter our world? What do they actually care about? They care about being elite performers, achieving better results, uncovering their biases, and just achieving better results, business, personal life, all that kind of jazz. Nobody cares. Nobody comes, like you said this very well, like nobody comes with a place of like, oh, I'm emotionally fragile, so I need emotional fortitude. I ignored reality because I wanted to own a term. I had a certain want, and that superseded my logic. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be. So first off, any questions about that?
No questions. I think I fall into the same trap again many times. And so that was, I guess, the catalyst for you sort of reconsidering this rebrand was that recognition or the realization that, hey, the growth is not growing aligned to my expectations and the sort of anecdotal feedback which I've been receiving from my current audience. Therefore, I've sort of realized that something's off. Would that be a fair sort of assessment of?
Yes, and more specifically, like I want to get into the tool that actually helped me really like pinpoint that. So we're going to get into the framework and that tool in a second.
Cool.
So that's that. But again, I want to like before we go into that, I just want to lay it on a principle level that the smart play is to figure out a strategy that is likely to work, not to go with what you would want to work. Those are two very different things. What I would want to work is very naive. It's not taking into account how the world actually works. That's living in fairy tale land. I think if I just manifest this, hopefully it'll come, people will like it. But actually saying the smart play is to figure out, okay, what is likely to work here? Not for me, because I have my wants, but if somebody else was trying to accomplish this, what would be the smart move? And when we simply ask that question, we have that, what they call the psychological distance, where I don't think about it from what I want, but I just say for somebody else who I don't have any connection with, I don't have any, my desires aren't theirs, what would probably work for them? That's probably going to give me a much better insight as to what would be more effective than just simply saying, how would I go about this? Because when we say, how would I go about this? What should I do? We always attach our desires and our wants and our emotions to that.
That's something which I believe that I have a pretty good ability to read in others, but a terrible ability to read in myself until I'm confronted with it. That difference between what would I like to happen or what would I want to happen compared to what is probabilistically the most likely to happen. It's funny how our emotions can just kind of creep up on us and take over the steering wheel.
Yeah, it's something my mom told me when I was a teenager. She said like we were talking about how I wasn't able to see something, and then she just explained to me very clearly. And there's an expression that if somebody came to me with my exact set of problems that I could not solve my entire life, I would set them on their way in 30 minutes. Figure it out like that. And just as a kind of a segue to what we're doing today, that tool of psychological distance, of just saying, not what should I do here, but what would I recommend that somebody else in this situation do? What should somebody else in this situation do? All of a sudden, it creates so much more clarity. Like I think trying to ask ourselves, what should I do here, and how can I be aware of my emotions that are steering me in possibly the wrong direction or whatever it may be? It's very complicated. It's very challenging. A workaround around that is just simply ask, what should somebody else do if they have these kind of goals and they're this kind of starting goal? What would be the most effective path? Because all of a sudden, we don't take into account their possible insecurities, their possible wants, whatever it may be. There's like, this is technically the most effective thing for them to do. But with us, we avoid asking ourselves what's the most technically effective thing to do, because oftentimes it's also the most emotionally uncomfortable. So we naturally just try to steer away from that without recognizing it.
Do you believe that emotional discomfort comes from a place of, whether it's conscious or subconscious, recognizing that we don't have the capabilities or the domain knowledge to actually make the most effective and efficient decisions? So our emotions kind of take control. Because the analogy that I'm thinking of here is, if I was trying to drive from Rome to Barcelona in the most efficient and effective manner, Google Maps is my friend. It's going to tell me how to get there in the best way possible. Not which way do I think I should go, which way would I like to go. I'm just going to use a tool that I have. But in business, we do this all the time. So do you think it's just our emotions fill the void because we don't actually really know how to measure, test, or we don't have the Google Maps of business?
Honestly, no, man. Because like, let's run through this kind of filter. what I have found working with like over 100 entrepreneurs, all the way from like 6 to 9 figures, that when they're really stuck on a problem, they can usually at least understand what the first most effective step moving forward is by simply asking, what should somebody else in this situation do? So they might not have the blueprint all the way from Barcelona to Rome, but they'll definitely know, okay, from Barcelona, I need to go on the highway. And from there, I'll figure out the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as you get people out of their own heads, and again, this is me included as the example here is showing, we're able to at least figure out what is the next step that's going to show us the next step. That would show somebody else the next step, that would show somebody else the next effective step, and building from there. I think a lot of times it's like the opposite. When it's us and we don't know the whole way, we don't even go sometimes. A lot of people just stop. But when somebody else, you're like, oh, dude, just do the first thing, then you'll figure it out. Put out the MVP, then you'll get feedback on it, then you'll grow, and then you'll figure out your marketing channel. That's part of life. That's the cycle. But when it's us, like, oh, unless I know this super works, I'm not going to go forward.
Makes sense.
Cool. So I want to explain the tool that kind of helped me really just, it put me in my track, so to speak, and forced me to look at this. So we just did a month with my old officer from the Special Forces. We did the Officer General program. So for context, he is one of the 5 officers that are ex-Special Forces officers that are also McKinsey grads in Israel. And they run a program called Officer General, which takes people from the military, the police, and the intelligence communities that are just below the general level, like high-ranking officers. And it helps them become better strategic thinkers as they're about to graduate into the general ranks. And what he said is that there's this kind of cycle where you go first, like when the strategy is working or not working, you have to first stop and go through this kind of cycle. And it's a 4-part cycle. First off, there's the embarrassment stage. You say, reality has embarrassed me a little bit. My game plan has been exposed. It's not working correctly. And I need to own that. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit. Then you go into the systematic inquiry, saying like, what is actually going on here? What is the actual truth of the lay of the land of reality that I operate within? And then now that I better understand the actual truth of what's going on, how can I create a new strategy? That's number 3. And then number 4, implement it. And it's kind of this consistent cycle. You have a new strategy, you implement it. Again, there's flaws. If it's a little bit embarrassing, whatever it may be. And for whatever, first off, any questions about that before we get going?
No questions about that.
Yeah. So for me, the embarrassment thing, because it was such a weird word, and it's something that we often use in the agency or in the special forces, you use these words that are not part of your everyday vernacular in order to shift you out of your everyday thinking. And embarrassment was that for me. I was like, man, this is embarrassing. Like, I thought the podcast would be much further along, especially because I think we have good quality here. People say they really enjoy it, but the numbers don't match the expectations. And I don't think this is just a volume play where if we just work harder and do more of the same, it's actually going to change the outcome. But something here is not working. And he gave that example. He said that how you coin embarrassment, understand that it's actually something that needs to be changed is if, for example, you launch a product with the goal of making $1,000 in the first month, and by week number 3, you're only at 150, and there's no, like exponential growth curve, it's foolish to say, I'll just work harder and it will work. It's like you need to acknowledge that the strategy isn't working and that you feel a bit embarrassed so that you can move on. And you have to own that. Not try to say, okay, I'm not embarrassed. I'm going to protect my ego by just pushing harder because that's easier than to own the emotional, like me saying I messed up. It feels a bit embarrassing. Especially I think a lot of us A-types, it's easier for us to work really hard and like grind our faces into the wall instead of just owning that we feel a bit embarrassed. And for whatever reason, when he said that, I was like, man, something with the podcast, like it's embarrassing. We should be doing better. And that was the first thing that really snapped me into saying, okay, I need to reassess what's going on. So any thoughts, questions on your end from that?
Probably a question about discerning when you're potentially on track, because a lot of things do have some kind of an exponential, the hockey stick sort of moment. And there's plenty of business examples where something sucked forever and then, the right person, right time, and they sort of cracked it and then they sort of reached their success. And then therefore the message is, just keep plugging away, sort of do the boring work. Whereas what you're saying is identifying almost like an equation so that you can become more aware of when you're behind where you should be. So like if in your example, if I also maybe that e-commerce example, If the goal is to make $1,000 in a month, it's week 3. If my only input in that equation is time, like each week equals $50 in sales,
Yeah.
I've got 1.5 weeks of the month remaining. Is it likely that I'm going to make $850 in the last month if the only variable I change is time? And under that equation, the answer would probably be no. So it's probably not just time, like you were saying with the pod. It's probably not just spending more time in the trenches and doing more volume. There's probably a branding issue, maybe some formatting. There's something else going on, which is not giving it the growth rate that you otherwise expected. Would that be like a fair sort of summary?
Very much. I think also what you're saying, that the plugging away and doing the boring thing, like, again, if you just keep plugging away and doing the boring things without changing anything, then it's just a time issue. It's like you have a great workout plan. Like, you've seen this. You give somebody who's brand new to working out a workout plan, and after the first week, they're like, dude, I'm not jacked yet. Yeah, you need more time under tension. There's nothing wrong with the plan. This is how it's supposed to work. But if someone's after like a year of working out, they don't see any results, like, something here needs to change, dude. Like, maybe it's your nutrition, maybe whatever it may be, the intensity, whatever it may be. But just understanding that, and basically how we said, like, sometimes people just need to like plug away and keep doing the boring work, and then eventually it gets figured out. It gets figured out because they're probably changing something.
Yes.
They are changing something. And this mechanism, this tool, is to help you really clarify, instead of just, oh, something kind of feels off, maybe we should change, maybe we should not. It just gives it a format to say, are we really like on the right track? If not, immediately let's cut it and let's figure out why. Let's reorientate and go faster.
I definitely, absolutely. I definitely agree. Whether it's a working out analogy or how long does it take to grow a plant, there are certain things where it just does require a certain time because it's part of the equation. Whereas often maybe those success stories that are shared in business, the person was grinding away forever, no one was paying attention, suddenly they cracked it. It might not just be time. It might be that what they were learning over that period of time was just constant iterations. And the reason they cracked it, the market took notice, was because what they were doing was fundamentally different to what they started doing years and months earlier. It was the improvement, not necessarily just the time.
Yeah, like the classic example is Edison. Like, he would just keep trying thousands and thousands of different things. He wasn't doing the same experiment 1,000 times. He was tweaking variables every time, and then eventually he would come to his great invention.
Do you find that's something which holds entrepreneurs back? Is they don't make that differentiation? They use the Edison quotes, or just, I'm just going to keep going. It's like, well, Edison wasn't repeating the same experiment every time.
What I've found from seeing the kind of entrepreneurs that I work with, the more A-type people that have a lot of sense of pride, like, I'm a bad dude, I can figure things out, I can make it happen. It's their pride and their ego that shields them from being able to recognize we need to change something. And that was what it was for me as well. Like, I see that in myself. I was like, how can I just push harder? Saying how can I push harder? For me, it's easier to push harder than it is to say, I did something stupid here and I need to change. I can say that, but what's my natural default is like, you know what, how can I just push harder? And I think a lot of us also, they come from, let's call it, a more physical background, like gym, jiu-jitsu, whatever it may be. We become really, really good at pushing harder because that actually gives a lot of results there. And sometimes we default to that when it's not the right thing to do. And that's why, for me, having this kind of framework where, first off, if something's not going according to the trajectory, stop and ask yourself, is there an embarrassment here? Don't just say, okay, let's push harder with this. Let's push it through to completion. Say, wait. First off, are we being even smart about this? Are we strategically being correct? Are we being effective? If not, let's own the fact that our strategy is a bit embarrassing and we need to fine tune that so we can actually be much more effective with the effort that we're going to put in.
Makes sense.
Cool. So that was the first thing, the first part of that system, the embarrassment. And I owned that. I was like, okay, this feels embarrassing. And I told you guys literally the next week when we did this workshop, I was like, guys, I recognize about myself. Like, we have an issue here. So then once you're embarrassed, how do you make sure you don't keep repeating the same mistakes? That either you have blind spots, or like what happened to me, that I ignored certain things that I saw because I had emotional wants that I put on this project. And for that, Tal represented this concept called the S.E.T. So basically, the way you create this systematic inquiry of understanding reality for what it actually is, not what you want it to be, and to also make sure that you see all the angles of it that you're not used to looking for, is this concept called the S.E.T, where you basically figure out what are all the components of reality that cause your venture to be more successful or less successful. And from that, you can build a strategy. And the components of the S.E.T were as follows: the stakeholders. First off, like, who are the parties involved in the podcast? Me, the host, you, the co-host, the listeners, the production team, all that jazz. Then the connections. How do they tie to each other? How do they all work together? Then the motivations, which I'll get back to. Like, what are the interests of each person? What will make them happy? What are their goals? Then the challenges. What are the challenges they present to me or my goals? The opportunities. Where are the points of leverage to exploit, and where are the opportunities they present to me and my goals? And then the limitations. Like, what constraints are you operating with? And when we went through all this, when I looked at the motivations, I was like, this is where I really messed up. Because I put my emotional one, what I wanted, my motivation, I wanted to own a term. Because I thought if I play this long-term game of owning a term in a couple of years, phenomenal results. I'm going to be like Tim Ferriss. That's what I probably had like an emotional want there. I thought about my motivation. I didn't think about the motivations of the listeners or potential listeners. They don't care about emotional fortitude. They just care about being elite performers and achieving all they want to achieve in their lives and their businesses and so on. And that framework of really forcing you to go step by step and seeing what you're possibly missing out on, for me, that was really, really big. Because that really forced me to see reality.
Did that come to you quite naturally as you started going through that process, identifying the stakeholders, the connections, the motivations, limitations, etc.? Was that something as you started to go through that process that immediately you recognized that there was a motivation that you had that wasn't shared by other stakeholders?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what was also interesting to me that when we later went over it with the whole group, I think 90% of the guys, that was their blind spot. They didn't look at the motivations of the other people involved in this. I think you were the only one that had something else that you didn't look at. But for pretty much everybody else, that was the main thing. And it makes sense. Like we're all intrinsically out for ourselves. Like we can say we want to make an impact and all that, but we're human beings, we're creatures, we're animals at a very primal level. We want to look out for our well-being. So naturally, if we're not aware of it, we're just going to look at what our motivations are. But that's not actually what creates a big win all around, like with the people that you want on your side, whatever it may be. And that was a really interesting thing that next time, like my very, let's call it compact mental model around this is that whenever I start a new venture, I need to be hyper aware to look at other people's motivations and their wants. It's not about what I want to get out of this or what I would hope or what I would like. And again, it's very obvious, like I coach people on this all the time and I can see them from the side, like, dude, you're not looking at your employee's motivation. You're not looking at this other this other company's motivation, whatever it may be. And I didn't see it in myself, which again, like we all have our blind spots and this is just a great tool to make sure that we don't stumble on it.
It's interesting here you use the word blind spot as well, rather than the word bias, because it sounds as though once you have made that realization, there wasn't a whole lot of internal resistance against the idea that maybe a change is required. Yeah. Whereas a bias might be, no, everyone else is wrong. This is the best name ever. They just don't see it yet.
Man, I think that's such an interesting point. I think all the emotional resistance went away the moment I acknowledged that we have an embarrassment. The moment I acknowledge that, okay, I'm embarrassed by reality, embarrassed me, so to speak, in this fair, again, like, I'm not an embarrassment, I'm not a failure, I'm a good human being, I have my self-worth, all that jazz. But just in this specific case, reality embarrassed me, and I can own that and be like, okay, emotionally, like now I took that hit. Okay, I've made peace with that. Now I can move on. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the real power of that embarrassment stage. You're saying, okay, wait a minute, take that emotional hit, own that. Now that you accepted that, you're not trying to avoid saying, I'm not really embarrassed because maybe this, because maybe we can figure that out. I can work harder. I can tweak this, maybe a little bit of that. But if you say, no, I fully acknowledge that. This feels a bit stupid. Like I'm an expert in performance and mindset, and I missed out on this. That feels foolish. There's no way around that. I did something that is embarrassing relative to like what I should be able to execute on. I did something embarrassing. The moment I can own that and make peace with that, now I can move on. So then from there, I just saw opportunities. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. And I think it reinforces how important it is to have tools and processes like this up your sleeve, because even a world-leading mindset expert can fall victim to our own blind spots, which shows you just how pervasive it is.
Yeah, it's the power of these tools. It's like, I think this is stuff that I would do intuitively for a lot of my clients before this, but now getting that kind of framework and having that tool to run myself and other people from, it just helps us make sure there's no leakage, so to speak, that we catch everything that needs to be caught. Make sense?
Yeah. Makes sense.
Cool. So that was actually going to be the common mistake that I wanted to talk about. The common mistake is not acknowledging embarrassment when it happens. The reality is that we always try to protect our egos. It's a natural thing. We try to protect our egos, our sense of self. And there's this whole term of like, if I do one thing that's embarrassing, I should feel embarrassed about myself as an entrepreneur, as a person, as a husband, as a wife, whatever it may be. And I think a big part of it is the framework, what allowed me to acknowledge that embarrassment so quick. Like, I'm proud of myself to be the kind of person that moves forward. Like, we're at episode, I think, 40 something now, almost 50. And like, I wouldn't have gotten into this insight if I would have just tried to stay in the background and figure this out. And like, like the whole, like, how do I get from Barcelona to Rome before even like stepping a foot forward? Because I have a better frame of how I view myself and what I take pride in, and not just like having a stumble, but saying that stumbles are really good, because that means I'm moving forward. I'm giving myself the opportunity to have a lot of flaws in my thought process and my business model exposed. I can be at peace saying I got embarrassed here. Like, this is what I'm supposed to be searching out for. It's like when I'm in jiu-jitsu on the mat, it's like, I want people to expose the holes in my game. So let me roll with the best people. Let me move forward as fast as possible. And I think the most common mistake is that people don't acknowledge when they feel a bit embarrassed about something, when something isn't working, the plan of theirs isn't working, either because they just don't want to admit it, because they want to try to outwork it, so to speak, the technical flaw in their strategy. They want to work really, really hard in a way that's not effective, not efficient, or because they're just afraid to admit it, period. Because they think if they're embarrassed in one way, they should feel like an embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts on that?
Hearing you unpack it makes me just really think about those two words and how powerful they are in my understanding: bias and blind spot. I was thinking about driving a car. If I've set up my side mirrors incorrectly, it's possible I have a blind spot and I can't see the car. And so maybe I do a shoulder glance and go, there's a car there. Okay, so that was a blind spot. And I'm not going to merge into that lane because of the blind spot, which I've been aware of. But if I can now see the car, so the blind spot is no longer blind, and I still choose to kind of like close my eyes and cross my fingers and say, there is no car, there is no car, there is no car, and I merge directly into the car, that would be bias or denial or just, disconnection from reality.
Yes.
And so I think that what you had was the blind spot, which we all have. That's why it's called a blind spot. And then the second you had a process or a tool to recognize it, it was kind of like adjusting the mirrors. Like, oh, there's a car there. Okay, now I can change my strategy. Yeah. But if you didn't change your strategy and just thought, there is no car, there is no car, there is no car, that would be bias, which might be harder to undo, because now we need to work out why you're clinging to a belief which is not connected to reality.
Yeah, I'll try to give a similar analogy to that, and a more visual one that I don't usually do. So stick with me. So
all right.
We've also all heard this story of somebody like going the wrong direction, and instead of recognizing, okay, I missed a turn, with other people in the car telling them like, dude, you missed a turn, they keep going out of ego. We all have heard this example, right? So I think to kind of say what you want, like, let's say we have our desire. Our desire is like, we're in Barcelona right now, we want to get to Rome. So all I'm fixated in is like how to get to, I look at Rome. Now, what I don't recognize is that there's a mountain range right in front of me, and I need to take a right in order to be around it for like safe passage, whatever it may be. And that's something that unless I'm able to actually see reality for what it is, I'm so blinded by my wants that I will drive into the mountain. Now, what can happen is that somebody will tell me, hey man, this is what's going on. This is the reality of it. Like, you're going the wrong way. You need to U-turn and take that turn again so you go around the mountains. And I can have that vision of reality where all of a sudden it's not my blind spot. But if my ego is still so strong because of my wants or because of my fear to acknowledge that I was wrong in one way, because I need to protect my ego, I might drive into the mountain range. However, if I can either let go of my ego by recognizing, this is not an issue that defines me, the fact that I messed up here, so let me just U-turn and go the right way, or I can recognize I need to understand everybody's motivation here to not just die and run into the mountain. I can look at it from that perspective. It's really powerful. And I think the first time, like acknowledging the embarrassment, it gives you the opportunity to see reality for what it is. Not just get blinded by your wants. Say, okay, wow, there's a mountain here that I hadn't taken into account. something you haven't taken into account, whether it's other stakeholders, their motivations, whether it's the connections, how they work together, the limitations we're operating in, certain opportunities, whatever it may be. But then also, again, like being able to say, I am a bigger person than this one thing, it allows you to say, okay, this feels embarrassing, but this is the right thing to do. And I take pride in actually being the kind of person that once they say that something they're doing is flawed, they don't stick onto it. They can move beyond that. And I think if you have those kind of components together, that's when you can find the most effective path to get to where you want to go.
Got it. So would you say in that situation, using one of your own phrases, when you aim for the trophy, you miss a target?
Yeah.
In hindsight, was it desire
It's not my
to...
phrase, by the way. I didn't invent that phrase.
Okay. Was it that you were focused on coining a term, sort of owning a term, and that created a gap where you weren't focused on the sort of metrics of growth and thinking, like, how do I actually make this easy for my audience to understand what this is and consume the information? It's more important that I own a term rather than I move the needle on engagement metrics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think when you think about it from a very pragmatic layer, what's more important for a company, to own a term or to actually grow? Like, it's like, yes, owning a term can make you grow, but I was blinded by it. I didn't think, okay, is this actually serving growth or not? I was like, I just want this thing. That would be really cool if I had this thing. And it doesn't work.
Yeah. I've definitely made that mistake in business on more than one occasion.
Where have you made that? Where do you think this is like a big example where you can look back at and say, this is kind of the same issue, but in a different way?
So many things, whether it's actually the business model, whether it's a business brand. I think it's the innovator's dilemma. We become the artist probably more than we want to. And that's where the emotions come in, our desire to do something different and better. And so if I came up with a new company doing X, Y, Z, I could come up with like a very ethereal, abstract name because I'm projecting my sort of emotions or ego into the future and thinking it'll be great when this thing that's very abstract right now is a household name. But by default of me making it so abstract, I might fail to get the first 100 people to even pay attention. Like I make it so abstract and so different that it's completely foreign and alien to anyone who actually could pay attention.
Do you think there's some part of you that's also like, I would feel really cool about myself if I can create something that's really abstract, but people just let
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
That's what I felt in me when I heard you talk. That I think a big part of it is like, oh, I want to feel cool about myself that I created this new term or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
There's that old business saying like, don't be cute. Stop trying to be cute. Just do what works. You know what I mean?
I even do it with Google Maps. I'm like, that's cute, Google. Let me want to find a shorter path. Turns out Google's right every time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a big lesson. Like, we got to recognize that we always want to find a sense of like satisfaction in ourselves or feel good about ourselves. But that desire blinds us to reality a lot of times. And that's where we can really hurt our results. Again, if all you want to do is like be an artist, be a broken artist, but you can feel good about yourself in that way, great. If you're looking for actual results, you got to recognize that's a voice that you probably need to learn to ignore. Like if you're saying, I would tell somebody else should do this thing and it matches, great. But if it doesn't, the advice that you would give to somebody else is probably more effective than what you want to do. Because your wants are not your logical thoughts. Those are different things. I think that's a big thing to watch out for. Go for it.
I want to ask, do you think that there's a dimension also behind that? This might be like layers of subconscious that when we start getting a bit fancy on things, do you think there's any merit in the idea that maybe it's also a defense mechanism? So if it doesn't work out, it's like, yeah, well, look, in hindsight, I did make it really difficult to understand and really abstract it. If I just made it really simple, if I owned a clothes washing business and I said, iwashyourclothes.com, is easier than calling it some sort of Puritan name, which might be really hard to understand what I actually do. Could it be a defense mechanism?
It definitely could be. Like, that's not the angle where it came from me, but it doesn't mean that it won't be for somebody else. It's like it could be a way for somebody to avoid having to really put themselves out there. Saying like, oh, if it's no one's really going to hear about it in some way, and I self-sabotage myself that way, then nobody can really judge me on if the product behind the name or whatever it may be is really good enough. It could be a way. Like people, I see this in hiring, people are like, I'm really, really terrified to give up control. So instead of me really clarifying the role that I need, I'll just hire somebody, and then it's probably not going to work out anyway, and I'll be able to tell myself, yeah, like, it didn't work out. Of course it didn't work out. Please don't work out. So I think there's definitely, like, it's a great point. It's not where it came from for me, but it definitely, I can't see it not existing for some. You know what I mean?
I see it happening in business models where people come up with very abstract business models. It's like a hodgepodge. It's like a coffee shop and clothing retailer plus art gallery plus doggy daycare, and they come up with a very abstract name. And I wonder, not only apart from the brand and our ego, our emotional wants to sort of revolutionize and come up with this, weird kind of concept store, maybe it's also because the individual knows that they're not a domain expert in any of those things. They're not a domain expert in running a highly profitable, efficient coffee shop or art gallery or anything else. So it's kind of easy to sort of bundle them all in together, wrap it up in some weird sort of wrapping, and then it might be a sort of a veil that we use to recognize that actually we don't have competency here.
I'll say this. This is really interesting because I think regardless if that's true, not, whatever it may be, it's irrelevant if you use this process. Because if somebody like that would have used a set where they had to actually break down the stakeholders, how they connect to each other, and what their motivations and limitations are, that process would have shown them this is a bad idea. It would have forced them to look reality in the face.
Great point.
And I think that's what was so beautiful about, like, just having that kind of framework, that it doesn't allow you to hide from reality because of whatever your wants are. And again, so I think I kind of want to wrap this up. I think it's going to be a powerful point to kind of drop off. The set is a really powerful tool, but you cannot access the tool if you're not willing to own that you need it. If you're not willing to own that embarrassment. I know it sounds weird, but having these kind of weird, out of everyday normal talk terms allows you to get out of your everyday normal thinking. So coining and embarrassing, like, the quicker you can avoid trying to outwork an ineffective strategy due to stubbornness or ego or thick-headedness or whatever it may be, and you can say, this isn't working the way I would have expected it to, the way it needs to work in order to get to my targets, then you can move on to a more effective strategy faster by breaking down the set and recognizing where were the flaws in the way I came up with this strategy. For me, it was, I didn't even take into account the motivations of the people that could be potential listeners, which is wild. It's wild. It's ridiculous. But it happens. And I think the sooner I can say, okay, this is wild. This was really foolish of me, but I take pride in being the kind of person that can own that and move forward. It's like, I know that's going to serve me really, really well in 5 years. I don't care about this momentary embarrassment because I know I'm doing the right things to get myself to a great place in 5 years.
Yep.
And that's what I would like people to walk away with. Anything in your end? I see you just have something about to come out.
So from my understanding, the podcast wasn't growing at the rate you expected or desired. You've gone through this process. The embarrassment was recognizing that your motivations to coin a term was different to the motivations of other stakeholders, whether that be audience, co-host, editors, etc. That's kind of like the epiphany moment, which explains maybe part of the disconnect between expectations and reality with the growth by going through that set. How now do you re-strategize after going through that? So I guess my next question is, where to next?
So with the podcast?
Oh yeah, just kind of like, now that you've learned that lesson in terms of the disconnect between your desires and what the market was receiving, how do you recalibrate that, either from a branding exercise or what's the sort of next steps?
The simple thing that I did, I went out to the people that are my ideal clients, the people that are in the, not just the arena, but the lead program. So these are the ideal clients. What are your motivations? Instead of me assuming, instead of me hoping to understand, I'd be like, what do you guys want out of this? And finding what's the common thread there. Ask them, what would you feel comfortable telling a friend of yours, like, dude, you should need to listen to this podcast. And not sound like, and not be able to say like, oh, it's like, it's really good, but it just kind of sounds kind of weird. But if you get into it, it's really good. Like, what would nail in there? Just asking the people straight up. Again, not having an ego about it. I mean, guys, I have my assumptions. My assumptions have obviously been proven very wrong. What do you guys specifically want? Tell me. And then synthesize that together. And that's how we came up with this Elite Performance podcast. That's all they want to be, is elite performers. It means something different to everybody. It's not 100% congruent. We might change it again as we learn and we grow. But for right now, it's a much bigger improvement that takes into account the biggest blind spot that we didn't take into account last time. It was the motivations of the ideal people we want to attract to this podcast and give them the tools that can help them grow and succeed, become better performers in their life, business, all that jazz. But I also want to say one thing.
No, please. I
think we we missed a crucial step. None of this is possible if you don't have the courage to set a target. People that just say, "Oh, just keep doing things and like it'll somehow grow." You don't give yourself the opportunity to see, are you falling behind your expectations and your targets and your timelines? I know it's very common. People say like, "Oh, I don't want to set a target because that's too intimidating. I'll just get going and I'll do and I'll learn across the way." Doing that doesn't give you the opportunity to say, is something here not working according to expectation, or are we on pace? So I think the first thing is you have to set a target. You can't debrief anything if you've succeeded or not if there wasn't an actual target to say, a benchmark. Is this successful or not? I think first you have to set that target, and then you can see if you're embarrassed that you're not getting along the way or you are. I just wanted to add that. But what did you have to say here, Matt?
Totally agreed. I think this highlights how powerful this process is, because it's like a concentric loop. You have gone through the embarrassment, gone through the sort of the analysis phase, and what the next step is in terms of branding, you're much more dynamic and flexible with, because you've realigned yourself to, how do I make this thing work? Like the visual analogy that was making sense to me, because I think this is such a common issue for most entrepreneurs, is that it wasn't an issue with the product. You've got plenty of clients who rave about your coaching. It was an issue with a branding exercise that might have gone, a degree left or right unnecessarily. So like the analogy might be, you've got a restaurant full of happy customers who come here all the time, and you're getting fancy with the name or the sort of the facade of the restaurant, which doesn't take away from the dining experience for those customers. And you could keep thinking about marketing efforts and branding and all the rest. So you could just simply turn around and go into your customers and say, "Hey, why do you come here?"
Yeah.
So I think that embarrassment cycle gets shortened each time that you probably deploy this process, because it gets easier to recognize. Of course, you need to have those targets. It gets easier to recognize, how would I make this more appealing to more diners? It's like, why don't you just walk inside and just speak to the people who know, like, and trust you, and find out what this means to them.
Yeah, and again, to put that into like the context of the set, it's the stakeholders. These could also be like, if you're in a different kind of business, talk to your suppliers. Like, what are your motivations? How can we make this a bigger win-win for us? How can I understand where you're coming from? Again, that's why I think having this kind of process where you actually have to walk yourself down through all this stuff is so effective. Now, the really cool thing is that I didn't tell you this because when we only got this yesterday, one of the guys in the Elite actually created a GPT about it. How when you tell it your business model and all that kind of thing, you took all the lessons from the Officer General program, and it spits out like the stakeholders, their connections, their interests, like the general things. You obviously, it's still AI that you have to edit, but it takes you a long part of the way. Yeah. So first off, we're going to share that in the links below. So if you want to just be able to do that for your business, it's pretty wild. You just go into the links below, you'll find it. You can get access to it immediately. It's free, all that kind of jazz, just to help you out along. That's number one. Number two, I think a really good and powerful question to ask yourself is, where are you perhaps not taking a wider view? Or where do you have certain blind spots because you really want something to work? Again, it may be that employee, maybe it's a product, maybe like us, it's a pod, whatever it may be. When you really want something emotionally, you're probably not thinking logically. And if you have clear targets and you can say, wait, this thing that I want, it's not on the right track. It's not. And I shouldn't just try to work harder to make an ineffective strategy work, because that's not what's going to happen. If you see that in yourself, and you can have the courage, honestly, to own the fact that you made a mistake, it feels a bit embarrassing, but you can handle that. And it's good because you keep exposing yourself and learning, and then go backwards and understand what's actually going on here and use this kind of framework. I think you can see massive success. So again, if you feel that you have something that you really want to work, but it's not, like, it's foolish to just try to work harder. Instead, do something a bit smarter, more strategic, more effective. Go back to the drawing board, own your mistakes, and see what went wrong. From there, you'll just have a more effective strategy and you can see better results with hopefully a lot less effort.
Awesome.
I think on that note, we will wrap it up for today. Again, guys, if you want that ChatGPT thingy about understanding the set and breaking it down for you, you can find the links below. Aside from that, have a great rest of your week, everyone.